You can also set this quantize to beat if you like.
Hello, tech support.
How can I record my own RPS patterns?
So we've seen how to play back patterns. Let's explore how we can record into them. Now we have 48 patterns here, and seeing we're going to write one of our own, we're going to have to decide which one of these we like the least. Once we've decided which one we're going to overwrite, we'll hold down record and hit the key that you want to record into. Now, if there's already a pattern on this key, we can hit 6 to erase it. You can see that while we're in record mode, all of these buttons here now perform the duties that are listed in red. So hit 6 or clear here and hit write to clear that pattern. So now we have to decide on certain parameters of our phrase. Actually, let me turn the volume of that metronome down so we don't go crazy. Let's start with loop length here. How long is it going to be? Now we can set the number of bars here with the up and down button. Let's select 2 bars. Next, just like a sequencer, we can adjust how fine we want to be in quantizing or auto-correcting our timing. Let's select off and move on to gate time. This is interesting in that if this is set to off, then the length of time between note on and note off will be the same as what you recorded into it. In other words, it's just like any other sequencer, you get back what you played in. But if you want to get more of a machine-like feel on these patterns, you can reduce this gate time. Now it's expressed as a percentage of the quantized time. There's actually a great diagram in the manual on page 78 that shows this relationship. I want to record just a straight bass line, so I will select real as my gate time, and the last setting we shall make is the metronome. Now we have 4 different levels of 2 different types of metronome. Choose your metronome. Actually, I'll bring the volume back up. Hit record and we'll adjust the tempo down a little bit. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Where we go. We'll hit exit, and now we can play that whole phrase back just by hitting 1 key. If you make any mistakes and need to erase some notes, you can either trash the whole thing by hitting number 6 clear here, or you can hit 5 and erase specific notes. While in record mode here, just hit number 5, and this will allow us to erase a range of keys. Just hold down the keys that you want to erase for the period of time that you want to erase them. If you ever want to copy a pattern from one key to another, hit Shift and number 7 here, our initialization utilities, and we'll go through until we see pattern copy. Just select the one you want to copy, hit write, and then decide which key you want the pattern to go to, and hit write. It's that easy.
Hello, tech support.
How do I use motion control?
Now, if you're like me, you'd probably just want to sit down and play keys all day and maybe have someone else move all the knobs and sliders for you, maybe even feeding you grapes at the same time. Now, seeing that's not going to happen, motion control is the next best thing. And basically, motion control records all of the knobs and sliders, and the JPs have 4 sets of motion control, and recording into them is very similar to how we record patterns in the RPS section. To get an idea, let's start a pattern playing here, and we'll hit the hold button so that it keeps on playing, and we'll hit motion control 1. You can hear how the sound is changing over time. I'll tell you what, let's erase this motion control by holding down record and hitting motion control 1. Then I hit 6 to clear and write. You'll notice that the patch will stay in whatever condition it was when motion control was erased. To get back to that original patch's settings, just reselect the patch. Now, if we were to hit motion control, nothing will happen. All of those motions have been erased. Let's record some new ones in from scratch. Hold down record and motion control 1. Hit 1 to decide how long motion control is going to last. We can go all the way up to 8 bars if we like. Let's select 4 and hit exit to see the bars counting off. Now we're now in standby mode, and the next knob or slider I hit will start the recording. So let's have something to play along with, so I'll hit hold here and we'll fire up a pattern. Let's get to tweaking. We now have a motion control that's been recorded, and it will play back those changes on any patch we would care to bring up. Let's select patch number 44 here. You can hear those changes coming from the motion control there. Now, if you want to add some more stuff, just hit record and motion control again. You can add more changes each time it goes round. But keep in mind that if you tweak a knob that has already been recorded on an earlier pass, you'll be overwriting that data. If you want to erase just 1 or 2 knobs worth of information, just hit number 5 here, erase, and you can select that knob or slider that you want to get rid of. If you want to erase all moves, hit number 6, motion clear, and hit right. There are 2 more settings we should go over underneath motion control, and the first one deals with whether a motion is restarted every time a key is struck. For example, let's imagine we have a motion set up that is opening and closing the filter, and it might sound like this. Now, if we're not holding a key down, this is basically what's happening under the hood. This slider is basically just going up and down. So depending on when we hit a key, it might be everything from this, and then maybe we hit the key again and we go, and we don't hear anything because the filter is already closed up. Under Shift 6 or Setup, we come across Motion Restart. Now, if we select this as being on, then the motion will start from its very beginning every time we restrike a key. By the way, the next setting here takes you from being in set A to set B for a total of 4 motion controls. Now, one of the coolest things about the JP8000 is that almost anything that moves on this machine can be synced to an external drum machine or a sequencer. Things like our LFOs, our arpeggiator and RPS, all those patterns, even our effects. Now let's go first over the one that's probably the most easiest to understand, syncing the arpeggiator and RPS section. Under Shift and 5, come across MIDI sync and set that to on. Now the arpeggiator tempo will be overridden by the MIDI clock that's coming out of my laptop here. I have a MIDI out from the laptop here going into the MIDI in of the JP8000. And in fact, I have a drum loop going through this laptop. And you can hear how if I adjust the tempo here, that the arpeggiator tracks with that tempo. Now, as far as the LFO and the effects are concerned, these need to be set up as far as being synced to external sources individually. To understand the LFO syncing, let's go into B88 here, and we'll bring up the LFO 1 depth in the filter all the way to the maximum so we can hear that effect. And you can hear that that rate is being adjusted by LFO's 1's rate. Hit Shift and 2, our performance part, and move around if you're not already there to get to LFO sync. You can see that we can set each of the parts, both the lower and upper, independently. Now we have the upper part selected here, and you can see that we have the sync set to off. That means that the knob is receiving no external sync, but it's using its own settings. As soon as you set this to anything else other than off, the rate knob will no longer work. It will now be controlled by either the tempo knob or external MIDI clock if it's set up that way. Now, the rate of this LFO is determined by two factors. One, the tempo, either from the knob or external sync, and the unit of measurements in the LFO sync screen. In other words, if this was set to quarter notes and the tempo was 120 BPM, then you divide that out and this LFO would be cycling twice a second. If this was set to half notes, then it would be cycling just once a second. So remember, it's always determined by two things, the tempo and the LFO sync screen. If you want a really cool, very slow LFO, you can set the sync to cycle every, if you go all the way down here, up to 8 measures. As you can hear, this is a really slow cycle, but it's one that will be perfectly in sync with your sequence song. The same can be done with both the chorus and delay. The JPs definitely are awesome synthesizers, but they're not designed to be your only sequencing workstations to be used in a sequencing setup. I mean, there are a bunch of keyboards out there that are fully multi-timbral and have oodles and oodles of voices, unfortunately with the same old sounds. But these guys are bitimbral. That means you can play two different sounds, two independent sounds through MIDI. You guessed it, the lower panel and the upper panel can each have a patch assigned to them, each with independent effects. Let's check it out. Under Shift and number 2 here, our performance part, go through until we see part MIDI channel. From here we can set the MIDI channel for each of the two parts, the lower and the upper. Let's select lower and put this on MIDI channel 1 and upper on MIDI channel 2. So then if we are in dual or split mode, we can have our sequencer play back two independent parts. You have two synths in one. Now if you happen to really like a stack that you have in dual mode and you want to sequence that, just set the track on your sequencer to send out on the same MIDI channel for those two parts and you will have that stacked performance. Now, connections. MIDI out of the JP8000 into your sequencer, and then MIDI out of your sequencer back into your JP8000 in your classic MIDI loop, which brings up the subject of local control. Now there's a switch in the JP8000 called local, and if this is on, then what happens is that when I hit a key here, it plays at the internal sound and also sends a message out of MIDI out. It goes through my sequencer, back out, and plays the synth engine part inside the JP8000 twice really. Once locally from the local keyboard and another one looped through MIDI a few milliseconds later. In order to get around this, let's set local control to off. Shift and 5 to get into our MIDI switches and scroll through until we see local switch. Let's set this to off. We've now disconnected the physical keyboard from the synthesizer guts in the JP8000. And in fact, if we didn't have any cables hooked up on the back, then we actually wouldn't be able to play the sounds locally. This is potentially a trap for new users. So Roland thoughtfully makes the JP8000 revert back to local control on whenever you turn the machine off and then back on again. So if we have it connected up in that classic MIDI loop that we talked about before, the keyboard will only send out of MIDI out, which the sequencer will record, and then when the sequencer plays back, that will go back in and play the guts of the JP8000. Let's go into our sequencer.